Good evening. The recent and still boiling controversy about the nature, the choice, the type, the assortment, the variety, the disparity, the quality, the benefits, and the dangers of available COVID vaccines shows clearly that the approximation of ideas cannot abate the vehemence of passion, as Edward Gibbon would say, and passion leads men to display behavior remote from the precincts of reason. All this has parallels with fundamentalist evangelists who proclaim fantastic religious beliefs to eager ears and unreasoning minds, or maybe missionaries exposing a metaphysical creed to illiterate shepherds. Indeed, we have seen and heard self-appointed health authorities, politicians, and a selection of lackeys who never saw a virus in their lives talking authoritatively about viral behavior on so-called prime TV. I do not intend to linger on vaccines, and if anyone should ask what side I am on, I will let them decide based on the context of this video. In this episode, I would like to conduct an unpretentious adventure of ideas and investigate the historical seeds and weak beginnings of an ideology that today has distilled, or maybe we better say condensed, into its later externation, that is, the COVID phenomenon. Considering that, as we will see, the number 3 is involved in this and other related phenomena, customs, folklore, and other various beliefs. The starting point, somewhat arbitrarily, will be Saint Joachim of Flora, who lived from 1135 to 1202, an abbot born in Calabria, Italy. And those who follow my historical video sketches series may recall or refer to the episode titled Zeitgeist, COVID, and the History of Medicine, where, among others, we meet the Saracens, that is, the inhabitants of Cerreto, Italy, etymological source for the term charlatan. Joachim of Fiore was called on site in Cerreto to decide on the fate of the self-styled healers of Cerreto, whom Joachim condemned in the strongest possible terms. Joachim of Flora lived in an age when European Christian society was still structured into two orders: the transcendental, referring to an entity whose proof only exists in faith, and the temporal. The Pope, through the Church, was the bridge to the transcendent, while the Emperor was the manager of the things of this world. The view of society as separated into the spiritual and temporal power derives originally from St. Augustine and is defined as Augustinian. The innovation of Joachim was to introduce the symbol of the Trinity into the course of history, and by so doing, he gave a physical habitation to a metaphysical concept, which would seem offhand a contradiction in terms. For Joachim, the history of mankind evolved through 3 ages, corresponding to the persons of the Trinity. The first age of the world was the fathers, the second the sons, and the third the spirits. The leader of the first age was Abraham, of the second Christ, and by 1260 AD there would appear a dux, or a leader, the leader of the third age. Echoes of such extraordinary prediction are even found in Dante's Divine Comedy. Dante lived from 1265 to 1321, namely in the foretelling by Beatrice or Beatrice, his platonic girlfriend on earth and sublime image of divine perfection in paradise. Beatrice envisions a time when the stars will bring about a messenger whose name is formed by 3 numbers, 500, 5, and 10, which in Roman numerals spelled D, U, and X, meaning dux, that is, Latin for leader. Dante's Dux was supposed to metaphorically slay the giant, in the instance being France, due to the intervention of the brother of the King of France in the internal affairs of Florence, as well as slaying the prostitute in the instant the church, then reputed to be at France's service. As the reader can surmise, Dante was unhappy with the church of his time, and he put at least 2 popes in hell. But Dux in Italian is Duce, and Duce was how Italians called Mussolini. His public relation machine went as far as identifying in Mussolini the leading Dux of Beatrice's prediction. By the way, I recently produced a video on Dante and the history of Italy that viewers can find also on my website. By his apparently neutral interpretation of a Trinitarian, goal-oriented history, Joachim of Flora introduced into the historical narrative a set of symbols that apply to the self-interpretation of history up to this day. The first symbol is the conception of history as a sequence of 3 ages, the third of which, in some cases, is also called the final third realm. In philosophy, the third realm means a world of internal consciousness. For example, and I will mention a few, the recently often repeated end of history means the triumph of unfettered neoliberal turbo-capitalism. In this triad, history moves from nation-states to communism, and after its defeat to the third realm of the Obamanesque exceptional nation. In all instances, the third realm implies or implied a finality, the goal of lives, the form of things unknown, the aim of mankind. Another example. A Russian monastic leader called Theophilus of Pskov, who lived from 1465 to 1542, wrote to Tsar Ivan IV suggesting the following. One original Rome, he said, had fallen to the barbarians, as we know, in 476 AD, and the second Rome, meaning Constantinople, had fallen to the Turks in 1452. Now, Moscow would be the third Rome, and there would not be a fourth Rome. Joachim himself envisaged or anticipated that, in the Third Age, the Church would cease to exist, for the spiritual gifts necessary for a perfect life would be granted to every man. In practice, Joachim envisioned a final society of monks, sufficiently and spiritually perfect so as to do away with all institutional authorities. Joachim's new age would come about through a transcendental eruption of the spirit that would make men spiritually perfect, meaning that Joachim, did not eliminate actually God from the equation, but following Joachim, humanists and encyclopedists began dividing history into 3 stages: ancient, medieval, and modern. French philosopher Auguste Comte, who lived from 1797 to 1858 and founder of positivism, saw in history the development of 3 phases: theological, metaphysical, and scientific. Marx and Marxism pointed the 3 stages of primitive communism, class-based society, and final communism. The second symbol, the first having to do with history as a sequence of 3 stages, refers to the figure of the leader. Joachim of Flora saw the leader in St. Francis, Dante in the mysterious character that I mentioned before, Machiavelli in the Prince, or the Prince of his major work. For Theophilus of Pskov, the leader, as I said, was Ivan IV. Along with the leader, Joachim envisions a third symbol, the prophet of a new age, the catalyst of the forthcoming third realm. What is the function of the prophet, we may ask? To make the course of history meaningful and accessible to human knowledge through direct revelation. One example, or one good example, are the fundamentalist Christians of the US South, typified by one of their leaders, Pastor John Hagee. They are essentially worshippers of Judaism because in their imminent third phase of history, the Jews will all become Christians. Hence the presence among them of a subsect called Jews for Jesus, and this is it's not a joke. Central to Christian Zionist belief is the Bible of Scofield, with his quite arbitrary commentary on Genesis 12.3. I'll not go into this, of course. But drawing on Scofield's tendentious, or rather very personal biblical interpretation, John Hagee claims, "The man or nation that lifts a voice or a hand against Israel invites the wrath of God." But to render the idea of a third realm possible, there must be a final meaning of history, accessible to human knowledge via human speculation. And here is the seed of all that will follow. But what is the inner and critical importance of the conversion of history into a sequence of 3 ages or stages? The 3-age model introduces a fundamental shift in the interpretation of history and equally important, in the interpretation of life, of our life, everyday's life. It is a Gnostic shift, and it borrows from the original heresy of Gnosticism, the idea that the world is separate from divinity, from the transcendent, from God, this world anyway. As all know, faith is the bridge that connects palpable life with the transcendent, and that bridge is eliminated. And if we like, in simplified terminology, Gnostic shift means that God is irrelevant in the conduct of human affairs on earth anyway. It may not have been the original intention of Joachim of Flora, but in the implementation of his 3 stages or 3 ages of theory of history, even in his original model, God becomes eventually unnecessary, not necessary. This ideological turn becomes clearer in subsequent developments of Joachim's thinking. Now, Marx, for example, dismissed any questions about God, the transcendent, the origin of life, the destiny of man, and the destiny of mankind. For him, these questions were pure abstractions, irrelevant to the, if you like, the consummation of felicity, which would come and would be concurrent with final communism. In the Marxian interpretation, God is the projection of what is best in man in a fantasized and inexistent beyond. And the turning point in history, concurrent with the third stage of final communism, will occur when man will turn his projection of God back onto himself, and therefore he will realize that he himself is God. From this, it follows that in this model, man is transfigured into Superman. It should be added that the transcendent is not exclusively an idea of Christianity. The Greeks refer to logos as the quintessential order, the essence of things, the essence of being. And as we know, the Gospel of John starts with, "In the beginning was the Logos," which in the more familiar translated from the Greek version or variant is, "In the beginning was the Word." In relation to this Gnostic disconnect, meaning God irrelevant to human affairs, we may recall Plato's symbolic representation of men living in a cave, who see projected on a screen the shadows of real objects stationed outside the cave, but the prisoners believe that the shadows are the real objects, and when someone enters the cave and tries to convince the prisoners about the illusion, they react angrily and kill him. Said in another way, The belief of a human-only finality of history ignores the effect on the world, and therefore of history, of what we could not possibly physically know because it relies on faith. But by assuming a Gnostic finality that is independent of God, thinkers achieved a certainty about the meaning of history and about their own place in it, in history, a certainty that otherwise it would not have been possible. Because we look for certainties, of course, to overcome uncertainties, with their consequent and attendant anxieties about uncertainty. But what uncertainty is so disturbing as to require the type of finality implied in the multiple division of history into sets of 3 stages each? What is this uncertainty? It is the very uncertainty of Christianity, because uncertainty is its essence. It is the substance of things hoped for and the proof of things unseen. In fact, the substance of things hoped for is only to be found in faith itself. Because, both poetically and practically, we are such stuff as dreams are made on, and our little life is rounded with a sleep. It is easy to overlook this self-evident truth, especially for and by those who are almost forced to lust for massively possessive experiences via endless messages now broadcast worldwide, anytime, anywhere. And in these conditions, men cannot even think of walking a turn or two to still their beating mind, as Shakespeare would say. For having been conditioned to accept the false god of materialism, they have made a god of falsity. But returning to the idea of the 3 ages and realms, in the late Middle Ages, humanists envisioned the 3rd realm as a triumph of an intellectual life throughout the globe. In the Age of Reason, the French intellectual Condorcet envisioned the 3rd realm as a unified civilization of mankind into which everybody would be a French intellectual. With the advancement of science and scientism, the 3rd era of Auguste Comte, the founder of positivism, would replace his 3rd era would replace the era of Christ. Underlying the 3-stage variation of the Gnostic truth, truth in essentially godless world, is the idea that the world, or at least Western society, is moving purposely towards an ever-improving better end. However, at this juncture we meet with a paradox. Beginning sometimes in the 19th century, a new literary trend became popular, showing the decline of Western civilization and its inevitable demise. And emblematic of this mode of thought, of these ideas, was Spengler's book, The Decline of the West. Yet, simultaneously, there has been an unprecedented expansion in technology, increase in population, exponential, standards of living improving, and social civilization simultaneously advance and decline. For an answer to the paradox, we should again refer to the Gnostic Shift. Gnostic speculation removed the uncertainty of faith by assigning and devolving to man the ability to achieve the total fulfillment of his goals without the intervention of the Transcendent. And in this philosophy of life, the more easily envisioned creation of a terrestrial paradise substitutes the previously collectively spread concern about the life to come, the life after death, by declaring that they don't exist. The expanding civilizational effort absorbed into itself the eternal destiny of man, and substituted the civilizational effort for the life of the spirit. Nietzsche, summarizing the situation, asked why men should live in the embarrassing condition of needing the love and grace of God. And he said, "Love yourself through earthly grace, then you no longer need your God, and you can act the whole drama of the fall and redemption within yourself." Yet, such brave new world did not completely dismiss the issue of the afterlife and the uncertainties about immortality. For example, in one variation of the three-stage theme, immortality could be obtained through literary or artistic achievement, or through economic success that ensured salvation. In fact, salvation through wealth was the essence of the Puritan Protestant philosophy, in which a purely Puritan God is the supreme capitalist who decides beforehand who are his favorite children by allowing them to become filthy rich, the filthier the better. Which reminds me of a pun told by a manager of a bank with whom I had used to deal, who said, "He who dies with the most money wins." One keen analyst of the process by which God is apparently maintained in the Gnostic interpretation of life, meaning God irrelevant in the conduct of human affairs, was a gentleman by the name of Richard Hooker, who lived from 1554 to 1600. The process of his analysis is interesting because it shows how to use Scripture to disguise Gnosticism, and it applies almost verbatim to the fundamentalist Christian religious sects that I referred to earlier on. Hooker showed that the Puritans used passages from the Bible to justify their legitimacy while disguising their actual intent. The chosen passages from the Scriptures were torn out of context to support the Puritan cause, while ignoring all interpretations that would not support it. At the onset of this Gnostic revolution, meaning God irrelevant in the conduct of human affairs, camouflage was necessary. For one reason, an openly anti-Christian movement would not have been acceptable at large. Furthermore, Gnosticism was too near in time to, let's call it, traditional Christianity for the new Gnostic founders to be unaware or ignorant of their own new direction. Still, a competent critic like Richard Hooker and others could easily point to the truth behind the camouflage, thus creating difficulties and embarrassment. Whereupon the new Gnostics developed some logistic instruments, as we would call them today, as useful today to advance the Gnostic revolution. As we know, the great revolution of the Protestant movement involved the admission that the interpretation of biblical meanings and tracts was free for all, according to individual preferences, background, and education. Inevitably, this would result in a Kabul overrun by Taliban-style conditions as regards the interpretation of the Bible, the Gospel, and indeed Christianity as a whole. The ingenious Puritan solution was to create essentially a new doctrine, formulated in scriptural language, but provided by Calvin himself. And the end result, we could call it, was a soft reversal of the free Bible interpretation advocacy of the Reformation under the very guise of the Reformation itself. Meaning, in other words, the brethren were free to interpret the Bible as they pleased as long as it was Calvin's interpretation. A situation that parallels what has today become of freedom of speech. Disguising the real scope of an action under false pretenses is, of course, as old as the mountains or the hills. For example, Iraq's weapons of mass destruction, bringing freedom and democracy to Afghanistan, and so forth. In an illuminating comment, the perplexed Richard Hooker said that Calvin gathered divine knowledge by the admirable dexterity of wit. In the 1500s, such commentaries as Hooker's were heresy, and indeed Hooker's pronouncements were denounced as absurdities that have not been heard in public places in this land since the days of Queen Mary. he had to apologize to the Archbishop of Canterbury for having indulged in some theoretical distinctions and excursions in my sermon. Philosopher Eric Voegelin proposed to define the new Calvin-based reading of the Bible as a Gnostic Quran. 4. Just as the Archangel Gabriel dictated the original Quran, which means, by the way, it means book, to Muhammad, so Calvin issued his Gnostic Quran to contemporary and future followers. Calvin's Quran would be the first of several. The 18th century Quran, par excellence, would be Diderot's Encyclopédie Française. In the 19th century, Comte published his Quran of the positivistic future, and, of course, Marx' Das Kapital was to be the communist Quran for millions. The second ingenious Calvinistic solution had to do with how to prevent embarrassing criticism of the type that got Richard Hooker in trouble. To eliminate a problematic questions of the new Quran's validity, criticism was and is forbidden, and or the critic will become victim of broadsided defamation or worse. And this rings a bell today as well. In the last triad I will mention here, that is, from the death of communism to sanitary scientific dictatorship, and finally to the Great Reset, the new archbishops of Canterbury have diligently and capillarily shut down and vilified critics of the dictatorship using the massive power of monopolistic communication media. That the price paid by the world at large has been the debasing and prostituting of the very concept of science was deemed small price to pay by the new Calvins, for the means justify the end of Gnostic felicity. Which brings me, as I said, to the most recent of the Gnostic triads, involving the death of communism, the sanitary scientific dictatorship, and the third realm, brought about by the Great Reset. As many viewers know, the Great Reset is also the title and the thesis of a book written by Karl Schwab, guru, bigwig, and founder of the World Economic Forum, heavily involved in the Bilderberg Group and so forth. Now, getting to the end of this episode, and while reading through the notes, I realized that for readers who grew up under the cultural and educational influence of nihilism and cultural Marxism, most of what I said here may almost appear as senseless speaking, or speaking such as sense cannot untie. For the very idea of the transcendent has vanished from what is euphemistically called the public discourse. Yet, attempting to make sense of history is perhaps the last refuge of the bewildered with uncertainty and of the emaciated with discontent. And though no explanation of our times is perfect, any is better than none. Besides, going to the bottom of things, searching for explanations is, in the end, I think, a way to be free. Therefore, I like to think that the ideas I exposed are self-evident enough as to attract some interest in themselves and in their divulgation. Though experience suggests skepticism and what someone called the desolation of disillusion. 4. Just as some people smoking gives them something to do with their hands when they are not using them, for many the official and corporate media gives them something to do with their minds when they are not thinking. Thank you for watching, and until next time, may all the number of the stars give light to your fairway. Good night.